President Trump says the senior administration official who wrote an anonymous op-ed about him is gutless, and he is suggesting that person may have committed treason. The piece was published Wednesday afternoon in the New York Times. It details what the author calls the president's amorality. In a statement, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders called for whoever wrote the op-ed to resign. Major Garrett has more from the White House.
We have somebody in what I call the failing New York Times that's talking about he's part of the resistance within the Trump administration. This is what we have to deal with. And, you know, the dishonest media, because you people deal with it as well as I do. But it's really a disgrace.
President Trump reacted defiantly to this opinion piece published today by the New York Times. The paper said the author was a senior administration official.
If the failing New York Times has an anonymous editorial, can you believe it? Anonymous, meaning gutless.
The author, who wrote many senior Trump administration officials, quote, are working diligently from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations. The root of the problem, the official continued, is the president's amorality. The author described meetings where the president, quote, engages in repetitive rants and occasionally made reckless decisions that have to be walked back. And the anonymous official claims there were, quote, early whispers within the cabinet of invoking the 25th Amendment, which would start a complex process for removing the president.
The book means nothing. It's a work of fiction. The book is a work of fiction. The book is total fiction.
The op-ed came as the White House was already pushing back on a new book by Bob Woodward alleging top administration officials had called the president disparaging names.
Oh, yeah, sure. He's lying. Sure. No, Bob Woodward. No, the book? You mean on the book?
Yes, the book. Yeah.
The book means nothing.
The book also asserts the president discussed assassinating Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad after seeing video of a chemical weapons attack on civilians.
No, that was never even contemplated, nor would it be contemplated, and it should not have been written about in the book.
And the president denied another of Woodward's anecdotes, that former top White House economic advisor Gary Cohn, quote, stole a letter off Trump's desk withdrawing the U.S. from a trade agreement with South Korea.
That was another thing in the book that was just totally false.
CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett is at the White House and joins us now. Major, you, of course, have done your own reporting on life inside the White House. Your book is coming out in 2 weeks. So based on what was claimed in the New York Times op-ed, does it seem like it was written by someone with knowledge of what goes on day to day?
It does in a couple of respects, and in some I find it somewhat hard to believe. Let's go to the hard to believe part, at least from my perspective and my reporting. There is a reference in this op-ed written anonymously by someone identified by the New York Times only as a senior administration official that early on in the administration there were whispers, and there's an implication it was at the cabinet level about invoking the 25th Amendment. In my reporting, I never came across any kind of serious contemplation of using the 25th Amendment, which is a tool by which the Constitution provides for the removal of the president. It's an elaborate one, very hard to achieve, but this op-ed suggests it was at least a topic of some degree of serious conversation early on in the Trump administration. I never came across any sentiment of that kind among the senior officials I had a chance to deal with in developing reporting from my book. So I find that hard to believe. And even if that were true at some level, quite obviously that has passed, because if it were an ongoing topic of conversation, this op-ed writer, one would assume, would feel obligated to convey that. But to the underlying statements that there are volatile aspects of the president's approach to decision-making, that's absolutely true. It is consistent with much of the reporting I did for my book. And yet, as the White House argues, and I also stipulate in my book, that unconventional, volatile approach is not without accomplishment and is not incapable of yielding results. The president has yielded results with a Republican Congress that, despite his, let us say, unique approach, has been cooperative, and they have advanced agenda items for the president in terms of the federal judiciary, deregulation, and tax reform. Those are the three principal ones. So the op-ed does speak to a phenomenon within the West Wing that the president can be unpredictable, he can be volatile, he can say and do things that have to be either walked back, which is a phrase used in the op-ed, or recalibrated. I think all of that is true. But that doesn't mean that the West Wing is ineffective or ineffectual, or the president's style is one that is, as the op-ed writer suggests, a threat to the republic. The presidency is here. The presidency functions every single day. And there can be those who have misgivings about the way it functions. But the reality is it is here. It is ever present every day. And as the White House pointed out today, it won the election. And until there is some other judgment rendered by Congress or the people in 2020, this is the presidency we have.
Now, Major, the president is accusing the person who wrote this of treason. Sarah Sanders says he or she should resign. Do you think there will be a concerted effort within the administration to root out what we all want to know, who the author of this piece is?
There might be, and it also feels to me, and this is just a sentiment, I don't have any actual reporting on this. I've talked to a lot of people who have lots of speculative ideas. It could be someone who's frustrated with the president's approach to free trade. It could be someone in the State Department who's frustrated with the president's approach to dealing with global issues. It could be someone in the Pentagon who is frustrated with the way the president talks about, at least initially, certain national security challenges, but then is talked out of it or comes to a different decision at some point down the road. All of those are viable options. I don't know who it is. Whether the administration will make a concerted effort to identify this person, it also strikes me that there is a certain aspect of the Trump phenomenon and its outsized nature and its highly publicity-driven nature that at some point in the not-too-distant future, this person might identify himself and strike a pose in public to reinforce that which has been published anonymously. That's just a sense I have.
And perhaps get a book deal out of it.
Well, there is something about the Trump phenomenon that those close to it, those around it, want to offer an opinion and then perhaps leverage it. Not unlike the way Donald Trump, long before he entered politics, used various means of publicity to leverage his own self-interest. That may be something that approaches us in the not-too-distant future, but that's just a hunch.
And Major, as you mentioned in your piece, this, of course, comes a day after Bob Woodward released excerpts of his book on the administration. Are the president's arguments against Woodward then holding up today?
Well, the president calls the entire book fiction, which is a pretty heavyweight charge against Bob Woodward, someone known for the right reasons as being a meticulous gatherer of facts, observations, memoranda, contemporaneous notes to reinforce the narrative he presents in his book. Now, look, I'm in a somewhat awkward position here. I think it's quite obvious. Bob Woodward and I have written books about the first year and a half of the Trump presidency. I'm in no position to question the veracity of Bob Woodward's book. He is in no position to question the veracity of mine, should he be so inclined. What the president has said is the entire book is fiction. Well, that's going to encounter some resistance from Bob Woodward and others who were source material for the book. What we do know is some of the quotes attributed to General John Kelly, current White House Chief of Staff, and the Defense Secretary, James Mattis, have been directly denied and, in the president's words, refuted by those two individuals, John Kelly and James Mattis. That does at least raise some questions about some of the issues and presentations of those issues in Bob Woodward's book. But if you take some of the things that Bob Woodward describes thematically about the president and you put them next to this op-ed, there is a commonality. When people read my book and I talk about some of the difficulties operating within the Trump White House, you will find some commonality as well. That's a thread that I think is pretty consistent. As for the president, one thing I know he's been debating internally is how much to fight against the Woodward book and how much to give Brett Kavanaugh, his nominee to the Supreme Court, the better part of the day. Well, the president, twice given the opportunity, weighed in on the Bob Woodward book, which certainly competed with the Brett Kavanaugh narrative before the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Indeed it did. Lots of competing narratives today. Major Garrett at the White House, thank you.
Sure.